So the first question would be that a couple of months you released the Oberheim OBX8. And what I would like to know is kind of how do you feel about it? And is it exactly the instrument you wanted it to be, or is there something like a compromise, even in such a beautiful, great, and expensive instrument? Or does it really fulfill all the wishes that you have?
First of all, it's important to understand that the OBX8 is really two generations of Oberheim stuffed into one box. Now, if you take the OBX8 out of the box and you look at the front panel and you look at the basic design of the metalwork and the graphics and things, that's me. Oh, you have to wait a minute. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I had to welcome the plumber into the house. We're having a plumbing problem. So when I look at that machine, I'm very proud because what you see with your eyes is for the most part something that I did in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The way that the switches and pots and that's something that I designed. I had help back, and that was in my first company, Oberheim Electronics, which was from 1970 to 1985. But inside, it's sequentials engineers doing the work. So when I first started talking to Sequential about what became the OBX8, there was a question of, well, what circuitry would be used? And they sent me the schematics of the machine while it was still in development. And essentially, if you press the right button, so you go into OBX mode, the circuitry is really exactly the SEM circuitry that was in the OBX. If you press the same button and get the OBX-A mode, then the circuitry is exactly the circuitry, or very close to the circuitry that was in the OBX-A in 1981. And if you press the same button and get OB8, then you activate the circuitry, the actual analog circuitry in the OB8 in 1980 from 1983. John? So I was very, I was quite happy to see that. And then there was another element that was important in that back in the 1980 to 85 timeframe, I had a very young kid work for me for those 5 years, whose name was Marcus Ryle. And Marcus later worked for me those 5 years, started his own company, and 20 years later sold that company to Yamaha. That company was Line 6. And Sequential asked Marcus to, Sequential talked to me about the machine. I got a prototype to work with, and they also did the same with Marcus. And Marcus is much more attuned to hardware than I am, because he's a different kind of engineer than me. And they worked diligently, I'll say very diligently, to get the sounds in the OBX8 to be the sounds in the OBX, the OBX8, and the OB8 from 1980, 81, 83. And so it was quite an interesting thing, and I was very happy to see this. So this machine is not digital simulation. It's not digital signal processing to simulate. It is the actual circuitry. So if you go into OBX mode, you look at the circuitry, there's the there's certain resistors, they're the same resistors. You look at the transistors or whatever, it's the same thing in each of the three modes. So I was quite happy to see that.
Fantastic. So it's exactly the way you wanted it to be.
Yeah, well, the concept originated with Dave Smith.
Yeah.
A year and a half or 2 years ago, I don't know how long. And so he worked on that. I was kind of aware of it, but I didn't contribute because the circuitry is in the public domain, and it's really a sequential machine inside and Tom Oberheim machine outside, but they're put together to where they work together that way. And so although I didn't have that much to do with it in the 21st century, I had a lot to do with it in the 20th century.
I see. Great.
And of course, already the machine, which was shown for the first time in June at the NAMM show, has proved to be very popular. And so I think that the decisions that were made were the correct ones. I think it's a fabulous machine.
If we go back a little bit in time, so I would like to know, you just told me how you were inspired by jazz music, as I understood. And I mean, so am I. But I would like to know, when was your first contact with electronic music and how did you feel about it? The way that happened for me was I went to college at UCLA, which is in Los Angeles. My major was physics, and this was in the 1960s when colleges were cheaper than they are now, and I was able to get a degree, a bachelor's degree in physics at UCLA, but it took me 7 years because I had no financial help. I had no family money or anything. I had to work full time to get through college. And so I really couldn't take a full load in physics every semester. So I started taking music classes just for fun. And I continued that. I didn't get a music degree, but I met a lot of musicians because I would go to physics class, and then when I was done at physics class, I'd go a few steps to the music building where I had a lot of friends. When we all graduated in 1966 or in that time period, a couple of these friends started music groups, and that was when electronic music was starting to be a little more popular than just in universities and things. And a couple of these people asked me to build them some electronic music equipment. One case, it was a ring modulator. Well, actually, in two cases, it was a ring modulator, some power amplifiers for this guy who had a group that toured, so that he needed power amplifiers. I built some power amplifiers. And then, so from 1970 to 1985, I continued this. I started building phase shifters and other analog electronic music stuff. And that's how I got started. But I didn't ever have a thought in those days, 1970 to 1975, of ever becoming a synthesizer maker. It wasn't, I knew about synthesizers. I didn't know a lot about them, but I knew about them starting the 1970 period. And, but I was still in school. And so I was working to support myself and one of the things I did was
I went to the NAMM show in Chicago in 1971, and I went by the ARP booth. ARP was just new in the business, very new in the business.
Yeah.
And I got this idea that because I had seen some demonstrations of synthesizers by a studio musician in LA, and I went up to ARP and I said, "Do you have a dealer in Los Angeles?" And they said no. And I said, "Well, I could be your dealer." And they said, "Well, we want Guitar Center or something like that." And I'm thinking to myself, well, it's too early for synthesizers and Guitar Center. So I asked them, a few months went by, I asked them again, they said, "Okay, you'll be our dealer for now." So I became an ARP dealer, and I still remember the day I received my first, this was before the Odyssey, so my first ARP was a 2600, and I received it, opened up the box, and I played with it for the next 36 hours and learned every little circuit that, well, I did, of course, I understood what the circuitry basically did. I knew what an oscillator did and what a filter did, but I learned the ARP 26, and then I started selling it. And it was not too hard a job, because my first customers were people that had bought my ring modulators and other analog pedals I was making. I just already had their phone numbers in my book, and so I became an ARP dealer, and that went on for 2 or 3 years. It wasn't my main business, because my main business were ring modulators, phase shifters, filter pedals, etc. But I decided, because of my 10 years as a digital engineer, got the idea to build a digital sequencer. So I did. I designed a digital sequencer that was a little different than most of them, and then you could play the keyboard, and you could play the keyboard on your synthesizer to load the sequencer, and it stored the pitches and the durations of the notes. And so I sold a bunch of those, but that brought up a problem. In those days, the person who had a synthesizer to augment their instrument collection usually only had one synthesizer. It wasn't in the days when people had 5, 6 keyboards. And if you wanted to use my digital sequencer, you could load a sequence and play it back. But then if you were doing that, you couldn't play your synthesizer. Or if you needed to play your synthesizer, you couldn't use the sequencer. So I came up with this idea for a very simple, inexpensive synthesizer voice. My concept was the simplest analog synthesizer that would be very good, and it was what I ended up calling the SEM, Sequencer Expander Module. And I sold some of those by themselves, and I specifically chose to use a 2-pole filter, because the machines that were popular in those days were the Odyssey and the 2600 and the Mini Moog, and well, the exception of the Odyssey, both the Mini Moog and the 2600 had 4-pole filters.
Yeah.
So I decided to use a 2-pole filter, just to give the musician the option to have a different sound. I wasn't trying to make a Mini Moog copy or a 2600 copy. It was just, it was to supplement the Giving synthesizer. So I designed that in 1974, and I sold some of them. But then in January of 1975, the company that was distributing my pedals called up and said, "We're canceling all orders. Business is not good." And so all of a sudden I had my business in one day, the main business went away. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had this idea, well, what if I put 4 SCMs together with a digital keyboard and make a polyphonic synthesizer? So that's what I did. It was very crude because they were not programmable. The SCM was not programmable. So when I got my first, I called it the Oberheim 4 voice. When I got that first one built, it was like, it sounded really good, but it was a beast to play because there's no memory. So if you want to change a patch, you had to do it manually off as many as 100 knobs and 40 switches or something. But I put it together and I started to sell it. And in those days, my company was 4 or 5 people, I think. And it started selling very well. And so, although I didn't plan to get in the synthesizer business, I was now in the synthesizer business.
Okay, I really think it's one of the best sounding modules ever. But what I think is really interesting about it is the filter itself. I mean, despite of the fact that it's a 2-pole filter, it has the kind of that you can change the mode from low pass via notch to high pass. And as far as I know, it was the first filter who did that. I mean, I don't think that there was an inspiration for you to do that. So how can we, where did
I'll tell you, actually, I wasn't the first to do that. Although I never sold an ARP 2500 because they were very expensive. But the ARP 2500 was actually ARP's first product before they did the 2600. It was a large, it was like a Moog, big Moog, and there was modular, with different modules, except it didn't use patch cords. It used some switching arrangement. And one of the modules that you could buy for your ARP 2500 was a module that used a 2-pole filter. And the engineer who designed that filter and also designed the circuitry in the 2600, who I never actually met, but we got to be to know each other. And he actually gave a technical paper at an AES convention in 71, I think, that talked about this filter. And I saw that and I said, well, that's interesting. That's going to sound different from the typical 4-pole. It has this ability to change the modes from low pass to high pass to notch. And so I made the decision to put that filter in the SEM.
Okay.
It's a classic textbook circuit. It's not, it's not something that I invented or that he invented. If you study analog electronics in the university, and you'll find in a textbook this circuit, basically this kind of circuit that can do, just by its very nature, it puts out low pass, band pass, and high pass. It's just the physics. It's just the physics of it. It's not an invention, really. It's just this right out of the mathematics.
Okay, but kind of you made it sound good.
Well, that was a different. That's when I had an engineer working for me at the time who, well, actually, to be the way the SEM was done was, I purchased the design of the VCO from Dave Rossum, who started EMU Systems. I purchased the filter from this ARP engineer, whose name was Dennis Colin. And the engineer that worked for me at the time, whose name was Jim Cooper, he designed the envelope generators. And also Jim put together the prototype of the SEM with the circuitry from from the people I just described. and he gave it to me to test. And when I started testing it, I wasn't really that happy with the way the sound was. And so for 3 or 4 days in my lab, I basically tried different arrangements of the level of the VCOs going into the VCF. And I experimented with that because the VCF was not, it's not a circuit that is linear. It distorts very easily. And what my engineer Jim had done is he was concerned about the distortion. So he had the signal levels going into the filter at a fairly low level. Well, as I experimented with it over those few days, I increased the level of the VCOs going into the filter until I liked the sound. And that's how we got the sound. Because there's an infinite number of possibilities how to do that depending on the circuitry of the signal levels. But that was, I think some of it was luck and some of it was listening. Mm-hmm. But it does sound good. Of course, in the beginning, when I first started selling that, the SEM, 1974, I had a number of people say, well, it's interesting, but it doesn't sound like a mini Moog.
and you said, I mean, that's the whole idea behind it.
That's right. That's what I told them. And at first, some people didn't understand that. But then as we know, and now, now we can look back after, 50 years or so and say, yes, that was probably the right decision.
Mm-hmm. I mean, very special and unique thing about the SEM was as well, actually, the design, the color. It was the first white synthesizer, yes, I think.
Oh, because everything else was black. Even my 2600 was black.
I see.
Okay. So I said, everything's black, so I don't want to be black. I didn't want to do white. I didn't want to do red or blue. So I did, I don't know, it's kind of beige.
Now, I really think kind of the first step for us musicians of Oberheim electronics was, of course, the SEM, and that is really kind of a major breakthrough.
Up to the 4-voice, 8-voice, my business was small, very small.
Okay.
It was, I was doing what I did with my company up to that point, a little like an overgrown hobby. Mm-hmm. I didn't have any dreams of being a great synthesizer, a guru designer. I was just enjoying it because I had done so much concentration of digital stuff in the 1960s when I was a computer engineer that I just didn't want to do that ever again. I was burned out on that, and I was happy to be doing something that was totally non-digital.
Okay.
And so the 4-voice, which I brought out in 1975, toward the end of 1975, I started selling a lot of them, and I had to expand my business up 8 or 9 people, and I sold quite a few 4-voice, and I also sold it as an 8-voice. And I still didn't really think that being a synthesizer person as the rest of my career, but I did hire people, and everything was kind of fun because we sold the 4-voice, 8-voice. They were expensive, and they were easy to do because they were just SEM circuitry. Yes. In fact, they were SEMs, mm-hmm. The actual SEMs. And so, but then in the spring of 1978, the NAMM show, which was normally in Chicago, they had a small NAMM show at the Disneyland Hotel in Anaheim, just near Los Angeles. And I was exhibiting there. It was in the basement of the Disneyland Hotel, very small show, and there was down the hall in another room was this sequential circuits company that had a thing called the Prophet 5. And me and my two engineers looked at it and said, oh, well, it's so, maybe it's kind of like a polyphonic mini mode. But by the end of 1978, the sales of my four voice had almost come to zero because Prophet 5 was such an important instrument in that it made it easy for people to do interesting things with synthesizers, and you could. It was easy because it's all in one machine. You could auto tune the oscillators. You could store patches. It had a great sound, and so I basically had to make a decision. And this was like I said, in the mid latter part of 1978, as my four voice, eight voice sales were heading for zero. What I was going to do with them. So I decided that I would have to be a little more serious about having a company. And so my engineer, Jim Cooper, and I decided at the end of 1978 that we better do something quick or we would be out of business. And so we developed the OBX in 7 months. And when we showed it at the 1979 NAMM show in Chicago, June of 1979, I'm sorry, it was in Atlanta that year. And by the end of the first day at the NAMM show, we'd sold enough that we knew that the company would survive.
Congratulations.
And so I went from one situation where it was like an overgrown hobby to a real business. Mm-hmm. And that's when we started to expand, hire more engineers. And then over the years, we went from the OBX to the OBX-A to the OB8 to the expander, the Matrix 12, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And when you designed the OBX, what was your first idea? What did you want to bring into this music instrument?
The only thing we had to do was learn how to use a microprocessor. We had to get a microprocessor development system. We had to make some of the elements of the SEM programmable. So we had to program resonance and program envelopes, etc. That was made easy by I had gotten to know Doug Curtis, who designed Curtis chips. So we had some of the early Curtis chips in the OBX. So it was basically making the circuitry programmable and putting it all in one box with memory, etc. So it was pretty simple. We did it in a very short time.
Okay.
But it's SEM circuitry. It's again the same. If the SEM has this certain resistor, then the OBX in the same place had the same exact resistor. So it was 4 SEM voices.
When you introduced the expander and the Matrix 12, that was kind of a real step forward. It was an outstanding instrument in its own right. Could you tell us something a bit like, what was your inspiration to design it? What was the major goal you wanted to achieve with these instruments?
Well, first of all, I should mention that from a creative point of view, the expander and Matrix 12 was really the creation to a large extent of Marcus Rao and his partner Michel Douadic. Marcus, I may have mentioned, when I met Marcus, he was 19 years old. He hadn't even finished high school. He was working in an electronic music lab at a university in the southern part of Los Angeles. I met him, even though he hadn't even, he'd never gone to college. He hadn't even finished high school. I just met him when I gave a demonstration at this college where he worked, keeping the electronic music lab in tune, so to speak. And I met him, and it's like he was brilliant. He was brilliant. He was in his teens and getting gigs, playing big time gigs, playing keyboards in the LA music scene and for movies and recordings at age 17, 18. The thing that impressed me was that he had convinced the professor who started this electronic music lab that they should get a synclavier. And they did, and he knew it backwards and forward. He demonstrated it to me. And basically, after 1 or 2 hours there, I hired him. It was the first job he'd ever had, a regular job. And he really contributed to the growth of Oberheim. He and his partner both did, from 1980, when the only product that we had really was the OBX. We were still selling a few other things. And then by 1985, we had OBX-A, we had OB8, we had the Matrix 12 expander, DMX, DX, DSX. His first job at Oberheim, my first company was called Oberheim Electronics. His first job at Oberheim Electronics, he was 19 years old, was the DSX polyphonic sequencer.
Okay.
And so as we went through the early years of the 1980s, I was not forced, but it was my job to run the company. And more I let the creative people, engineers at the company, make some decisions. And Marcus and his partner, Michelle, wanted to do the expander. Of course, once we did the expander, it made perfect sense to do the Matrix 12. So it was a combination of we had grown enough to where we had the resources to do it, and we had the reputation in analog synthesis, and I just kind of said, "Go for it, guys," and that's how that came about. And it's very really wonderful machines.
Yeah, without any doubt.
Because I had by then had a company of 80, 90, 100 people, I was pretty much in the area doing that. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Peter principle. Have you heard this term before?
No.
The Peter principle was a theory that a professor at MIT or something wrote a book about, where he theorized that in an organization like a company, the participants in that company tend to rise to their level of incompetence. And that was exactly what I was doing. I was a good engineer. I wasn't a trained instrumental musician, but I had a lot of experience singing in choirs in my college days. And so here I was doing a job that I did not like and doing a poor job. Mm-hmm. And the result of that was, of course, that it led the company to where in 1985, I owed some money to the bank. The bank was happy. And then one day they weren't happy again, and they closed the company down. But I was fortunate to have some very good engineers working for me. like so many synthesizer companies, they were all musicians as well. And so, and things had gotten more complicated. You know, MIDI had arrived, thanks to Dave Smith. And these were all things that I felt it's better that I let the young engineers do it while I tried to keep my company going. So I wouldn't say that the main thing I did on the Matrix 12 and Expander were to insist that they used, instead of using pots, they used encoders, if you know what I mean by that, and also use alphanumeric displays, because that wasn't common yet. And so the electrical mechanical thing was I was involved with some of the, and the packaging, the metalwork, but the concept of it as a musical instrument was a combination of the engineers working for him, and mainly Marcus and Michelle.
And how did you feel about it when you heard it for the first time? When you listened to the prototype?
Well, of all the Oberheim polyphonics, from the OBX to the OBX8, OB8, Matrix 12 Expander, my choice was always the OBX8, only because it was between the OBX and OBX-A. The OBX barely worked, and the OB8 was a little too fine. So I liked the uncertainty. There's a level of uncertainty in the middle between the two machines. That the OBX-A was a lot more reliable than the OBX, but it wasn't as perfect as the OB8. So that carried over into the Matrix 12 and Expander. And again, they were a slightly different concept. They're still analog though, which was good, basically analog. It's like children, they're all, like, if I had 5 kids, I'd love them all. But so, and this goes back to the OBX8 to, if a person was an Oberheim type person, and one guy likes an OBX, one guy likes OBX-A, one likes OB8, OBX8, you get them all. So very interesting concept.
Yeah, it's really like the conclusion of your work, you could say.
Well, it was a conclusion, it was not exactly my choice, but in May of 1985, the bank shut us down, and there's not a lot I could do. Everybody had to go and do other things. It was a sad moment. But the interesting thing about it, over the long period, is that the basic elements of the Oberheim had something that overcame the bankruptcy of Oberheim Electronics and overcame the invasion of digital machines, especially from Japan. Yeah. To me, the interesting story is that Oberheim and other analog things died in the late 1980s, and it had a rebirth in the early 2000s. And I think it's to some extent due to the dance crowd, the guys and gals that were starting out doing dance music, and they went to the pawn shops where the machines were cheap, and they bought a TR-808 for $50, and they bought old Oberheims for a few $100s, and that was the sound that they grew up with, and now we're back.
Now we're back. Yeah,
We're all back.
it's an exciting time actually to be a musician. Um, and I mean,
It is, I think.
in the 90s, you started Marion Systems with the
Yes.
MSR tool. Could you tell us something a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, the my concept of the MSR2 as a system was much too grand for my resources.
Mhm.
The idea of that was, I guess, the birth of the MSR2 idea was actually in the late 1980s. I was no longer running Oberheim. I was working as a consultant in Silicon Valley or doing stuff. But a friend of mine, I went to this friend of mine's studio, and he had a wave station.
Yeah.
And he he MIDI'd his wave station to his I think he had an OBXA, and I just thought that was fabulous. Just to be able to play those two machines together, totally different technologies. One's analog, one's one of many ways of doing digital.
Mhm.
It wasn't. He didn't MIDI it to his DX7 or something else. He did it to his wave station. I just thought it was. I was just blown away by that. The combination of the two. So my original idea for the MSR2 is to have modules that could go in a mainframe and different technologies, but the mainframe MSR2 was organized so that you could have an analog card, you could have a wave or a wave station type card, and the operating system would allow you to combine those so that you could have different voices coming from different modules. That was the original idea. And I got it as far as having an 8-voice, 8-way multi-timbral module that would go in this mainframe, and you could have 2 of those modules in the mainframe. So you'd have 16 analog voices, 16-way multi-timbral with an operating system that allowed you to work them with them together from one interface. But like I say, I got as far as the analog. I ran out of money, and that was it. I did sell a few hundred. There were some problems with them because nothing serious, but I just simply ran out of money, and there's nothing I couldn't continue the idea. And so that's the story. I think if I put it on the market now, where you could have in a 2U rack, 16 voice, 16-way multi-timbral, I think it would sell. Mm-hmm. This also had a graphic equalizer been into. All of this was programmable. Everything was programmable, including not just the elements of the voice, for instance, attack and decay and filter frequency, whatever, but also the how you combine the 2 modules of different technologies together. Yeah. But I just was too big of a project for one person.
So that was designed entirely by yourself? Yes.
Okay. Yeah. The software, the firmware was designed by a friend, mm-hmm. But all the hardware and I designed all the hardware.
That's fantastic.
Another one of my children.
Yeah, and I mean, and then after that, we didn't hear anything from Tom Oberheim for quite a long time. Do you want to talk about that period? You don't have to.
Well, it's very simple. At the same time that Oberheim Electronics was put to sleep, in 1985, there was a lot going on in the industry outside of just Oberheim. In 1986, Sequential went out of business. Lynn Electronics went out of business for different reasons, I'm sure, because I've never talked to Dave or Roger about the details of what happened to their companies. But the world became workstations, whether it was a D50 or an M1 or whatever, that's what people were buying.
Yeah.
And I think my attitude at the time was, between what happened to Oberheim Electronics and the lack of success I had with the MSR2, it was time for me to be more concerned with supporting my family. And so I started consulting in Silicon Valley, and I did that for a number of years. Then in early 2000s, I heard that Dave had gotten back in the business because he did other things as well, yeah, with the Evolver.
Mm-hmm.
And but I didn't really look at that in the 2000s. I just didn't I didn't want to take a chance on investing in that on my own, and because I was by then I had a family, and I was more concerned about supporting my family, and I wasn't sure if I could do it. Mm-hmm. The technology had really advanced greatly to where the machines were becoming highly very much so that they were software based, in so many ways. And I was not and never was a software engineer. It's never something that interested me. So I think it was more a case of the only choice one had was to further move the technology along, and I didn't feel I was capable of doing that because it was more and more software. I certainly didn't expect to see the analog revival that happened in the early 2000s.
So you were taken by surprise by that analog wave.
I'm sorry?
You were taken by surprise.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
yeah,
did people like Dave Smith or Robert Moog, did they feel the same like you?
I think Dave saw. I don't know about Moog because of the East Coast West Coast situation. I knew Bob well, but we didn't hang out because he was I only saw him at NAMM shows. But I think Dave had a lot more experience in. First of all, he was not only a hardware engineer, he was a fantastic software firmware engineer, and he'd had some experience. His experience continued. I got out of electronic music machines, and when my consulting was not in music at all, and he stayed in the business. And one of the things he did was set up a Korg R&D thing in Silicon Valley. He was, I think, had a better vision, and I just didn't think that I wasn't going to start a company again and spend a lot of money and put my family in jeopardy. Mm-hmm. Now things got better, and then I discovered that a lot of people still would like to have an SEM. So I did start building SEMs in the 2013 timeframe, and then I did the two voice in 2015. But again, it was just by myself, so that was a limiting factor.
How many SEMs did you sell from the new ones?
The new one? Mm-hmm. Oh, about a little over 1,000.
That's it. Yeah.
We sold a little under 400 of the two voice.
I see. And whose idea was it to build the OB6?
Well, I was on an airplane flight with Dave and Roger. We went back. We flew back. The three of us flew back to Sweetwater to do a panel discussion, and on that the Sweetwater private jet was really exciting. And on that flight, Dave just brought up the subject. What would you think of us doing an Oberheim based machine? And I said, that's great. So that became the OB6, and it's did very well. That's 6 or 7 years ago, and still doing well.
So it's as simple as that. You're hanging, I'm just putting in my words, you're hanging out with a close friend and he's suggesting it. And
yeah, that's exactly what happened. My only contribution to the OB6, other than obviously it was going to sound like an Oberheim, was the blue lines. that was my main contribution. But it did very well. It's still selling very well now, 6 or 7 years later, because it's a great instrument.
Mm-hmm. How nice! How nice to hear that. So, now to sum up all these things, now with all the experience you have, so probably, what would be your advice for young developers of electronic instruments today?
Well, the first thing to do would be to get very heavily involved in Eurorack so that they could become aware of what's possible, because there's so many things possible with Eurorack now, so many very creative modules and stuff. I think that would be critical. Mm-hmm. Whether they got into the Eurorack business or not, that's another thing, but they learn what's possible, and then it's a matter of understanding what musicians might want to do. People say, well, did you get all your ideas for your stuff from musicians? I said, no, that's not the way it works. You have to know what the musician might want or need and combine this what's possible with the technology. So there's two things you have to do. There's more than two things, but those are two important things. But the way that the Eurorack thing has happened, there's so many choices. I think it's a lot easier to learn about the technology or what's musically useful than it was, 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. I can't envision someone being successful in the business that's not also a musician and has a love for whatever area they want to tackle. It's whether it's a new grand piano or some of the stuff that Dave Rossum's now doing in Eurorack and some of the other things that you have to understand that from a technical point of view, and you have to understand it from a musical point of view. Mm-hmm. And there's many ways to go in the musical area. And then you have to decide, do you want to be one guy in a garage, or do you want to build a company that becomes very successful? And that latter choice is very difficult, because it takes a lot of money these days to develop a new product. Yeah. It's not just an idea. It's I've had this subject brought to me a number of times by people that aren't really know how modern electronics companies work. And I always say it's kind of like an inverted triangle, inverted pyramid, where at the bottom is the idea, and that's the easy part. Then the next step up the ladder is maybe getting a prototype working, and the next step up the ladder, and each one of these jobs gets bigger and bigger and harder to do. Then you take it to some musicians and get their feedback and see if then there's if that looks good. Then the next step is the financing. How do you financing building it? How do you finance marketing it, selling it? And so a person has to decide how big a pyramid they want to have to tackle. It's interesting. A lot of things that happen in our business that makes it an interesting thing for a small person who wants to have a small company, and Eurorack is certainly one of them. But then pedals are, so-called pedals are still a very popular thing, and that industry keeps growing and growing with new people coming in. So you have to pick your area that matches your talents and facilities. Mm-hmm. It's doable. New companies come along all the time. The other thing is it just can't be technology based though, because the musician, a trained musician hears things that us engineers don't hear, and that's a big. I mean, I look at, for instance, taking a little glance at what's going on in the pedal thing. So many pedals that are super popular are it's not based on brand new technology. It's older stuff. Yes. And so it's a tricky business. It pays to be a musician, and so you can at least you can judge whether what you're doing is the right thing on your own, and then you take it to other musicians and get further. But on the other hand, it's a fun business. It's not like being in an office and writing computer code all day or something. It's a wonderful business. I think we're at a point where we're talking about a musical instrument as a product where it's the same now as it was many years ago. What do you do next? Mm-hmm. Some people have a talent for that, but it's not an easy solution. If you're in the computer business, it's easy. It may not be technologically easy, but it's easy to choose. It's got to be faster and cheaper.
I see. Yeah.
And but that's not automatic. That's not an automatic successful thing when you're dealing with something that a musician will use. There's a special thing about that. Mm-hmm. And the engineer in me would say, why would you care if the pedal you're using has a germanium transistor, which aren't made anymore, and yet those pedals sell by the thousands? Somebody solves the problem how to get a germanium transistor. Anyway, that's about it.